January 17, 1943. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The morning air hung thick with the salt of the Pacific, dense and heavy as wet cloth against the skin. Above Henderson Field, the sun climbed slowly through layers of tropical haze, casting long shadows across the coral runway where mechanics worked in silence. The metal was hot to the touch even at dawn. In the distance, the jungle breathed, a constant rustle of unseen life, punctuated by the calls of birds that had learned to ignore the sound of engines. Lieutenant Saburo Tanaka stood beside his Mitsubishi A6M0, one hand resting against the fuselage still warm from yesterday's sortie. The paint was chipped, the metal patched in 3 places. He had flown this aircraft for 8 months, through skies that had once belonged to Japan alone. Around him, his squadron prepared for another patrol, another hunt above the endless blue where American transports dared to venture. They moved with the practiced economy of men who had done this 100 times, checking fuel lines, ammunition belts, control surfaces. No wasted motion. No excess words. Tanaka lit a cigarette and looked toward the horizon where sea met sky in an indistinct blur. Somewhere beyond that line, the Americans were gathering. Radio intercepts suggested something new was coming, but intelligence was vague, contradictory. New fighters, they said. Faster, perhaps. Heavier. It didn't matter. The Zero had ruled these skies since December 1941, and every pilot in the Imperial Japanese Navy knew its supremacy was built not on myth but on mathematics, on the ruthless efficiency of a machine designed to outmaneuver anything that challenged it. He drew smoke into his lungs and exhaled slowly. In his cockpit, secured behind the stick, he carried a photograph of his wife and daughter in Yokohama. He had not seen them in 14 months. The photograph was creased at the corners, faded from humidity and handling. He wondered if his daughter still remembered his face. Above him, thunder rolled across a cloudless sky. The mythology of air superiority in the Pacific had been written in blood and fire across 18 months of war. When Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, they did so with a technological and tactical confidence that bordered on arrogance, but it was an arrogance earned through careful preparation and ruthless testing. The A6M0, designed by Mitsubishi under the guidance of engineer Jiro Horikoshi, represented a philosophy of aerial combat refined to its essence: extreme range, extraordinary maneuverability, and sufficient firepower to destroy any opponent foolish enough to engage in a turning fight. The Zero could fly over 1,900 miles on internal fuel, allowing Japanese fighters to escort bombers deep into enemy territory and still return home. It could turn inside any Allied fighter in service, could climb rapidly to altitude, could maintain combat effectiveness at heights where American pilots struggled for oxygen. In the hands of veterans, men who had cut their teeth over China, who had learned their trade in the merciless skies above Nanking and Chungking, the Zero became an instrument of calculated terror. American pilots in P-39 Airacobras and P-40 Warhawks learned quickly and painfully that to dogfight with a Zero was to die. By early 1942, Japanese naval aviators moved through the Pacific theater with the confidence of men who had faced every Allied fighter and found them wanting. They shot down Dutch Brewster Buffaloes over Java. They carved through British Hurricanes defending Singapore. They hunted Australian Wirraways with contemptuous ease. The mathematics of combat were simple. The Zero turned tighter, climbed higher, and carried enough ammunition to destroy multiple targets in a single sortie. American tactics evolved not toward victory but toward survival. Never turn with a Zero, never try to climb with a Zero, never engage alone. But empires built on technological superiority carry within them the seeds of their own obsolescence. While Japanese factories struggled to increase production, hampered by limited resources and industrial capacity, American shipyards and aircraft plants were awakening to a scale of manufacturing that defied comprehension. The losses at Pearl Harbor, the humiliations at Wake Island and the Philippines, the bitter withdrawals from Java and Burma, these were not endpoints but catalysts. Somewhere in the sprawling industrial landscapes of Connecticut and California, in the design offices of Vought and Grumman, engineers were learning the lessons that dead pilots could no longer teach. The Americans were building something new. The Vought F4U Corsair was born from failure and necessity in equal measure. When the U.S. Navy issued specifications for a new carrier-based fighter in 1938, the requirements seemed almost contradictory. Maximum speed, maximum rate of climb, maximum range, all packaged in an airframe suitable for the confined operations of a carrier deck. The solution that emerged from Outfough's design team was radical. A fighter built around the most powerful engine available, the 2,000 horsepower Pratt Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial that produced more raw thrust than anything flying in American service. But power alone creates problems. The massive propeller required to harness that power, over 13 feet in diameter, necessitated a unique inverted gull wing design to provide ground clearance while keeping the landing gear short enough for carrier operations. The result was an aircraft that looked aggressive even when standing still, a predatory silhouette of bent wings and massive engine cowling that earned it the nickname Bent Wing Bird among the Marines who would fly it. The first prototype flew on May 29, 1940, and immediately demonstrated performance that exceeded every expectation. The Corsair reached 405 miles per hour in level flight, faster than any American fighter in production. It climbed at over 3,000 feet per minute, reaching 20,000 feet in less than 7 minutes. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, carried enough ammunition to sustain 20 seconds of continuous fire, an eternity in aerial combat where most engagements were decided in bursts lasting less than 3 seconds. But the Corsair's path to combat was troubled. The carrier trials revealed a litany of problems. The long nose obscured the pilot's view during landing approach, the landing gear bounced unpredictably on carrier decks, the engine torque could flip an unwary pilot into a deadly spin. The Navy, desperate for reliable carrier fighters, initially rejected the Corsair for shipboard operations and diverted production to the Marine Corps for land-based use. It was a decision born of frustration, but it would prove fortuitous. The Marines, operating from crude airstrips carved from jungle and coral, needed performance more than they needed docility. They needed a fighter that could climb to meet Japanese bombers before they reached their targets, that could outrun and outfight the legendary Zero, that could carry bombs and still dogfight on the way home. They needed a weapon that could turn the mathematics of aerial combat upside down. The 1st Marine Corsair Squadron, VMF 124, arrived at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in February 1943. The pilots who climbed into those cockpits were not the fresh-faced recruits of 1941. They were survivors, men who had learned to fight in obsolete aircraft against a superior enemy, men who had watched friends die because their planes couldn't climb fast enough or turn tight enough or hit hard enough. They had been told to avoid dogfights, to make slashing attacks and run, to never trust their aircraft in a sustained engagement. Now they sat behind 2,000 horsepower and wondered if the legends were true. The first encounters were not battles but revelations. Japanese pilots who had grown accustomed to the predictable performance of American aircraft, the solid but unspectacular Wildcats, the limited P-39s and P-40s, found themselves facing something that defied their accumulated experience. The Corsairs appeared on radar as isolated contacts, climbing impossibly fast from Henderson Field to meet incoming raids. Japanese bomber crews, accustomed to several minutes of level flight before American fighters could reach their altitude, suddenly found themselves under attack while still climbing to bombing height. Lieutenant Commander Masajiro Kawato, a veteran of the carrier battles at Coral Sea and Midway, recorded his first encounter with a Corsair in his operational diary, a document later recovered from Rabaul after the war. His entry for February 14, 1943, captures the disorientation perfectly. "We were at 18,000 feet when the Americans came up from below, but they came up so fast, climbing through our formation before we could react. I rolled to follow one, and he simply climbed away. My Zero, at full power, could not follow. I fired but hit nothing. He disappeared into the sun above us. We lost 2 bombers before reaching the target." No one could believe what we had seen. The mathematics had changed. The Corsair could outclimb a Zero by nearly 1,000 feet per minute. At altitudes above 15,000 feet, where the thin air robbed the Zero's engine of power, the supercharged R-2800 Double Wasp continued to produce maximum thrust. The Corsair could dive faster than anything in the Japanese inventory, dive speeds approaching 450 miles per hour that would tear the wings from a Zero attempting to follow. And while it couldn't turn with a Zero in a low-speed dogfight, it didn't have to. Corsair pilots learned to fight vertically, using their superior power and speed to dictate engagement terms, climbing and diving at will while Zero pilots struggled to follow. But it was the realization of what this meant that truly shattered Japanese confidence. For 18 months, their tactical doctrine had been built on a foundation of known superiority. They understood American tactics because those tactics were responses to Japanese strengths. American pilots avoided turning fights because Zeros turned better. American pilots made hit-and-run attacks because they couldn't sustain combat. American pilots operated in fear because the mathematics of combat favored Japan. The Corsair demolished that foundation. Now it was Japanese pilots who had to avoid sustained combat. Now it was Zero pilots who watched in frustration as American fighters climbed away from them, reformed above them, attacked again at will. The psychological impact was profound and immediate. Combat reports from Japanese squadrons in the Solomons during spring 1943 show a marked shift in language, from confidence to caution, from aggressive pursuit to defensive concern. Pilots who had once hunted American aircraft with near impunity now filed reports describing fighters that attacked from above with great speed and could not be caught in climbing turns. The mythology of Zero invincibility, built over 18 months of victory, collapsed in a matter of weeks. Saburo Tanaka encountered his first Corsair on March 7, 1943, during an escort mission over the Russell Islands. His squadron of 12 Zeros was covering a formation of Betty bombers targeting American positions when the attack came, not from the flanks or below, where they had learned to expect American fighters, but from directly above and behind, diving out of a cloud layer at speeds that seemed impossible. He saw the lead Corsair first, a dark shape growing larger with terrifying rapidity, wings bent in that distinctive gull configuration, 6 machine guns firing in precise convergence. The Betty bomber ahead of him simply came apart, wing fuel tanks exploding in orange fire. Tanaka yanked his stick-hard left, rolling into the defensive turn that had saved him a dozen times before. But the American didn't follow into the turn. He continued his dive, building speed, then pulled up sharply and climbed straight up at an angle that Tanaka Zero, at full throttle, couldn't match. Tanaka watched the Corsair rise through 20,000 feet, through 22,000 feet, disappearing into the glare of the sun while his own aircraft struggled at 19,000 feet, engine straining, airspeed bleeding away. He leveled off, scanning desperately for the American. The attack came from above again, another dive, another burst, another bomber exploding. And again the Corsair climbed away, untouchable. In 12 minutes of combat, Tanaka's squadron lost 4 bombers and 2 Zeros. They claimed no kills. The Corsairs simply climbed out of reach whenever a Zero attempted to engage, reformed at altitude, and attacked again. It was methodical. It was ruthless. It was unlike any combat Tanaka had experienced in 3 years of war. That evening, gathered in the operations tent at their base on Bougainville, the surviving pilots spoke in hushed voices about what they had seen. The younger pilots, men who had joined the squadron after Midway, seemed shaken. They had been taught that skill and courage could overcome any disadvantage, that the Zero's maneuverability made it superior to any American fighter. But skill and courage meant nothing when the enemy could simply climb away from you, when your aircraft couldn't reach the altitude where combat was being decided. The older veterans said less. They understood what this meant in ways the younger pilots did not yet comprehend. The margin of superiority that had allowed Japan to dominate the Pacific Air War was gone. The Americans had built a fighter that was faster, that climbed better, that could engage or disengage at will. The tactical flexibility, the ability to choose when and where to fight, had shifted. And in a war of attrition against an enemy with vastly superior industrial capacity, tactical flexibility was the only advantage that mattered. Tanaka wrote a letter that night, a letter that would never be sent, found years later among his personal effects after his death over Truk Lagoon in 1944. In careful characters, he tried to explain to his wife what he could not say in his censored official correspondence. We are fighting a new kind of enemy now. They have learned from their defeats, and they have built machines that surpass our own. I do not know if we can overcome this. I do not know if skill alone is enough anymore. The transformation of aerial combat in the Pacific during 1943 was not merely technological but philosophical. The Corsair represented more than superior engineering. It embodied a fundamentally different approach to warfare, one rooted in industrial abundance and systematic problem-solving. Where the Zero had been designed for a specific tactical doctrine, optimized for one kind of fight, the Corsair was designed for adaptability. It could dogfight when necessary, but it didn't have to. It could escort bombers, strafe ground targets, carry bombs, intercept at high altitude, or engage at sea level. It was not a perfect aircraft. Early models had persistent problems with engine reliability and cockpit ergonomics, but its core performance characteristics gave pilots options that Japanese aviators simply didn't have. This philosophical difference extended beyond aircraft design to the larger context of how each nation approached the war. By mid-1943, American aircraft production was reaching scales that Japanese planners had never anticipated. Vought alone was producing over 500 Corsairs per month. Grumman was manufacturing similar numbers of F-6F Hellcats. Factories in Buffalo, St. Louis, and Dallas were churning out P-47 Thunderbolts. The sheer volume of aircraft arriving in the Pacific theater meant that American squadrons could absorb losses, could train new pilots in combat conditions, could experiment with tactics knowing that destroyed aircraft would be replaced within days. Japanese production, constrained by limited raw materials, disrupted supply lines, and factories increasingly targeted by bombing raids, struggled to replace losses. A destroyed Zero represented not just a lost aircraft but a gap in capability that might take months to fill. Experienced pilots, killed in combat or lost to accidents, were replaced by hastily trained recruits with minimal flight hours. The qualitative advantage that Japanese naval aviation had enjoyed in 1941, veteran pilots flying superior aircraft, was eroding with every passing month. The Corsair became a symbol of this transformation. Japanese pilots began calling it whistling death, a reference to the distinctive sound its engine made during high-speed dives, a sound that became associated with sudden, devastating attacks from above. The name carried weight beyond simple description. It represented the psychological shift from confidence to apprehension, from hunting to being hunted. In radio intercepts translated by American intelligence, Japanese pilots could be heard warning each other about the bent-wing fighters, coordinating evasive maneuvers, abandoning attack runs when Corsairs appeared. By summer 1943, the impact was measurable in stark statistics. Japanese bomber formations attempting to strike Guadalcanal or the Russell Islands were suffering loss rates approaching 50% when Corsair squadrons were present. Fighter-versus-fighter engagements, once heavily favoring Japanese pilots, had shifted to near parity, and in engagements above 15,000 feet, Corsairs achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-1. The sky, which had belonged to Japan, was becoming contested territory. And then, as American tactics evolved, it was becoming American territory. The tactical doctrine that emerged from these early combats became codified in training manuals and squadron briefings across the Pacific theater. Marine and Navy Corsair pilots developed what they called boom and zoom tactics, high-speed diving attacks followed by rapid climbs to regain altitude advantage. They hunted in pairs and in divisions, with lead aircraft engaging while wingmen covered from above. They exploited the Corsair's superior speed to control engagement distance, attacking only when conditions favored them, disengaging when Japanese fighters attempted to force turning combats. The effectiveness of these tactics was demonstrated repeatedly in the bloody skies above the Solomon Islands, where Japanese efforts to resupply and reinforce their garrisons ran into coordinated American air defenses. The aerial battles of June and July 1943 saw Japanese naval aviation suffer catastrophic losses not just in aircraft but in the irreplaceable cadre of veteran pilots who had formed the backbone of their air groups since the war's beginning. Lieutenant Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces, described the frustration in his own combat reports. The Americans no longer fight foolishly. They refuse to engage on our terms. Their new fighters attack from altitude and speed, and when we maneuver to counter, they simply climb away and attack again. We shoot down those who make mistakes, but the skilled pilots are nearly impossible to engage. They fight like we fought in 1942, with patience and superior position. The parallel was exact and bitter. Japanese pilots were experiencing what their American counterparts had endured for 18 months. The helplessness of flying inferior aircraft against a superior enemy, the frustration of watching comrades die because their planes couldn't match the performance of their opponents, the grinding psychological toll of knowing that courage and skill were no longer sufficient. The difference was that American industry could replace losses, could learn from failures, could iterate and improve. Japanese industry, stretched thin across multiple fronts and increasingly cut off from raw material sources, could only watch its advantage slip away. The Corsair, which had begun the war as a troubled prototype rejected by the Navy, became the embodiment of American resilience and industrial power. By the end of 1943, over 4,000 Corsairs were in service, equipping Marine squadrons across the Pacific and beginning to re-enter Navy carrier operations as modifications resolved earlier landing difficulties. They served in New Georgia, at Bougainville, at Rabaul, wherever Japanese air power attempted to contest American advances. The bent-wing silhouette became ubiquitous, a constant presence that Japanese pilots learned to scan for, to fear, to respect. There is a photograph, taken at Torikina Airfield on Bougainville in November 1943, that captures something essential about this transformation. It shows a Marine Corsair being rearmed and refueled after a combat mission. The pilot, still in his cockpit, is eating a sandwich and drinking from a canteen while mechanics work around him. The aircraft's guns are being reloaded, the fuel truck is connected to the wing tanks, and fresh ordnance is being wheeled into position. The entire turnaround will take less than 20 minutes. The photograph is remarkable not for what it shows but for what it represents: the industrial system that supported these aircraft, the logistics that kept them flying, the abundance of fuel and ammunition and replacement parts that allowed American squadrons to maintain continuous operations. For every Corsair in the air, there were dozens of mechanics, armorers, fuel handlers, and support personnel keeping it operational. There were supply ships bringing aviation gas from California, ammunition from Connecticut, spare engines from Pratt and Whitney's factories. There were training bases in Florida and Texas producing replacement pilots faster than combat could consume them. This was warfare as industrial process, and it was a kind of warfare that Japan could not match. Japanese squadrons operating from Rabaul in late 1943 were flying aircraft patched with scavenged parts, burning low-grade fuel that reduced engine performance, conserving ammunition because resupply was uncertain. Pilots flew multiple missions per day not because they were maintaining an operational tempo but because there weren't enough pilots to rotate duties. The maintenance crews worked through the night to keep aircraft airworthy, cannibalizing broken planes to repair damaged ones. The contrast became stark when American forces captured Japanese airfields and examined the conditions under which their opponents had been operating. At Munda Airfield in New Georgia, captured in August 1943, Marine engineers found aircraft that had been repaired with wood patches, engines held together with improvised gaskets, fuel tanks sealed with tree sap. The spare parts storage consisted of crates of scavenged components, none standardized, all requiring custom fitting. There was no equivalent to the massive logistics system that supported American operations, no steady stream of replacement aircraft, no abundant stockpiles of ammunition and fuel, no training pipeline producing hundreds of new pilots each month. The Corsair, in this context, was more than a superior fighter. It was a manifestation of systemic advantage, of an economy that could outproduce its enemies, of an industrial base that could learn and adapt faster than its opponents could respond, of a society wealthy enough to equip its warriors with the best tools available and replace them freely when they were lost. Japanese pilots understood this even if their high command refused to acknowledge it. In their letters home, in their diaries, in their conversations recorded by prisoners of war, there runs a thread of weary recognition that they were fighting not just against superior aircraft but against an entire system of warfare that they could not overcome through skill or courage alone. The battles over Rabaul in late 1943 and early 1944 marked the final collapse of Japanese air superiority in the South Pacific. Marine Corsair squadrons, operating from bases in the Russell Islands and New Georgia, conducted systematic raids against the fortress that had once been considered impregnable. They came in waves, fighters sweeping ahead to suppress Japanese interceptors, followed by bombers targeting airfields, harbor facilities, and supply dumps. The Japanese response, initially fierce, grew progressively weaker as losses mounted and replacements failed to arrive. The November 11, 1943 raid exemplified the new reality. Over 100 American aircraft, including 48 Corsairs, attacked Rabaul's harbor where Japanese cruisers and destroyers were attempting to evacuate troops from Bougainville. The Japanese defenders scrambled nearly 70 fighters, primarily Zeros, to intercept. The ensuing battle lasted less than 30 minutes. The Corsairs, climbing rapidly to meet the Japanese formation, engaged at high altitude where their performance advantage was overwhelming. They destroyed 26 Japanese fighters and damaged dozens more. Not a single Corsair was lost to air combat. The cruisers below, attempting to maneuver away from American bombers, were left virtually undefended. After-action reports from surviving Japanese pilots revealed the extent of their desperation. They had attempted to engage the Corsairs in traditional dogfighting tactics, hoping that superior numbers and maneuverability could compensate for performance disadvantages. It hadn't worked. The Corsairs simply refused to fight on Japanese terms, maintaining altitude and speed advantages, attacking in coordinated pairs, disengaging and reforming whenever Japanese fighters attempted to close. The battle was decided not by courage or skill but by mathematics, by rate of climb, by maximum speed, by service ceiling. And in every category that mattered, the Corsair held absolute superiority. The psychological impact on Japanese air crews was documented in intelligence reports based on interrogations of captured pilots. One Zero pilot, shot down over New Britain in December 1943, described the experience of fighting Corsairs. "We knew they were coming. We could see them on radar, climbing from their bases. We climbed to intercept, but they reached our altitude before we could position ourselves. Then they attacked from above, always from above, diving through our formation so fast we could barely track them. When we turned to engage, they climbed away. We could not reach them. We could not hurt them. We could only watch and try to survive." The word survive appears repeatedly in Japanese documents from this period, a stark departure from the aggressive, offensive language that characterized their combat reports from 1941 and 1942. The transformation from hunters to hunted, from aggressors to defenders, from confident superiority to desperate survival, occurred over the course of less than a year. The Corsair was not solely responsible for this transformation, but it became the symbol of it, the tangible manifestation of Japan's declining fortunes in the air war. By spring 1944, the Corsair had evolved from an experimental fighter with questionable carrier suitability into the dominant naval fighter in the Pacific. Navy squadrons, having resolved the landing difficulties through improved training and minor aircraft modifications, began deploying Corsairs on carriers alongside the newer F-6F Hellcats. The two types complemented each other, Hellcats providing reliable carrier operations and excellent all-around performance, Corsairs offering maximum speed and climb rate for interception and air superiority missions. The statistics from this period tell a story of overwhelming dominance. In the first 6 months of 1944, Marine and Navy Corsair squadrons achieved kill-to-loss ratios averaging 12-1 against Japanese fighters. In some engagements, particularly those at high altitude, the ratios exceeded 20-1. The Corsair's combat record became legendary not through propaganda but through consistent, documented performance across hundreds of engagements. Pilots who had flown earlier American fighters, the outclassed Wildcats and Warhawks, described the Corsair as revolutionary, a fighter that finally allowed them to engage Japanese aircraft on equal or superior terms. Captain Kenneth Walsh, a Marine pilot who became an ace flying Corsairs from Guadalcanal, later reflected on the psychological shift that the aircraft enabled. "For the first 2 years of the war, we fought defensively. We survived. We learned tricks to stay alive against better aircraft. The Corsair changed that. For the first time, we could dictate the terms of combat. We could climb faster, dive faster, outrun anything they had. We could choose to fight or not fight. That choice, that control, it changed everything. We stopped being survivors and became hunters." This transformation, from defensive survival to offensive hunting, mirrored the larger trajectory of the Pacific War. The battles of 1942 had been desperate defensive actions, fighting to hold positions against Japanese offensives. The battles of 1943 had been contested transitions, neither side holding clear advantage. But by 1944, American forces were advancing with systematic inevitability, island-hopping across the Pacific, each operation bringing them closer to Japan itself. The Corsair, flying top cover over invasion fleets, striking Japanese airfields before they could launch counterattacks, sweeping ahead of bomber formations, became the aerial spearhead of this advance. Japanese pilots, those who survived long enough to accumulate experience, learned to fear the bent-wing fighters with a respect born of brutal lessons. They developed tactics to minimize the Corsair's advantages, staying at low altitude where performance differences were less pronounced, attacking only when numerical superiority was overwhelming, focusing on easier targets like bombers and transports. But these were the tactics of desperation, not victory. They reduced losses but could not prevent them. They bought time but could not reverse momentum. The symbolic weight of the Corsair extended beyond its combat record. For American forces in the Pacific, the sight of Corsairs flying overhead became synonymous with air superiority, with protection, with the reassurance that Japanese bombers would not reach their targets unopposed. For Japanese forces, the whistling sound of Corsairs in a high-speed dive became an audio signature of impending destruction, a warning that survival depended on immediate evasive action. The aircraft existed simultaneously as weapon and symbol, as tactical tool and psychological marker. There is a recording, made by a Navy sound technician on board the carrier USS Bunker Hill in March 1944, that captures this symbolic dimension. The recording was intended to document the sounds of carrier operations for training purposes, But what it captured was something more profound. As Corsairs return from a combat air patrol, their engines audible long before the aircraft are visible, sailors on deck stop their work to watch. When the first Corsair appears, there is spontaneous cheering. The technician's notes, preserved with the recording, describe men who had survived kamikaze attacks, who had seen ships burning and aircraft shot down, responding to the return of these fighters with visible relief and celebration. The Corsairs represented more than firepower. They represented protection, capability, the material evidence that America could build weapons superior to its enemies. This association between advanced technology and national strength was not lost on Japanese observers. In interrogations conducted after the war, former Japanese naval officers consistently cited American industrial and technological superiority as decisive factors in their defeat. They spoke of Corsairs and Hellcats, of Essex-class carriers, of radar-directed gunnery, of proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, a litany of innovations that individually improved combat effectiveness and collectively created insurmountable advantages. The mythology they had constructed around Japanese martial spirit and warrior tradition, around the superiority of their pilots and the invincibility of their aircraft, crumbled when confronted with enemies who simply built better tools and deployed them in overwhelming numbers. The lesson was harsh and absolute. Courage and skill matter, but they are not sufficient when facing systematic material disadvantage. The Zero pilots of 1943 were no less skilled than the Zero pilots of 1941, no less courageous, no less determined. But they flew obsolescent aircraft against superior opponents supported by superior logistics, and all their skill and courage could not overcome those fundamental imbalances. The Corsair pilots did not win through greater bravery. They won because their aircraft allowed them to fight on favorable terms, because damaged aircraft were quickly replaced, because ammunition and fuel were abundant, because the entire system of American warfare in the Pacific was designed to sustain continuous offensive operations. By the time the war ended in August 1945, Corsairs had flown over 64,000 combat sorties, had achieved an overall kill ratio of 11-to-1 against Japanese aircraft, and had proven themselves not only as fighters but as fighter bombers capable of delivering bombs and rockets against ground targets. They participated in every major campaign from the Solomons to Okinawa, operated from land bases and aircraft carriers, served with Marine, Navy, and even some Allied air forces. The production total exceeded 12,000 aircraft, making it one of the longest-produced fighter aircraft in American history, with variants continuing in service through the Korean War. But numbers, however impressive, do not fully capture the significance of what the Corsair represented. It was the aircraft that broke Japanese air superiority in the Pacific, that allowed American forces to operate without fear of air attack, that demonstrated the decisive importance of industrial capacity in modern warfare. It was the weapon that forced Japanese pilots to abandon offensive tactics and adopt defensive postures, that changed the psychology of aerial combat from Japanese confidence to American dominance. Saburo Tanaka, the pilot who had watched Corsairs climb away from his Zero over the Russell Islands in March 1943, did not survive to see the war's end. He was killed in February 1944 during a raid on Truk Lagoon, shot down not by a Corsair but by anti-aircraft fire while attempting to attack American torpedo bombers. His squadron, once numbering 24 pilots, had been reduced to 6. Most of the replacements who arrived were barely trained, boys of 18 and 19 with less than 100 hours of flight time. They flew patched aircraft with failing engines, conserving fuel and ammunition, knowing that each sortie might be their last. In his final letter home, written a week before his death and delivered to his widow after the war, Tanaka wrote, "I have seen the future of this war, and it is not ours. The Americans have built fighters that surpass our best, and they build them faster than we can destroy them. I have done my duty, but I no longer believe it is enough. Tell our daughter that I loved her, and that I fought for a Japan I believed in. But tell her also that strength is not measured only in courage. The Americans taught me that. They taught me that a warrior with a superior sword will defeat a warrior with an inferior blade, no matter how brave the latter may be. We were given inferior blades, and we were asked to compensate with spirit. I tried. We all tried. It was not enough." The Corsair's dominance in the Pacific was neither accidental nor inevitable. It resulted from specific decisions made by engineers, procurement officers, and military planners who understood that technological superiority could compensate for numerical disadvantages and inexperienced pilots. It resulted from an industrial system capable of translating design innovations into mass-produced reality within months. It resulted from a tactical doctrine flexible enough to exploit the aircraft's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. And it resulted from pilots willing to abandon preconceptions about aerial combat and adopt new methods suited to new capabilities. The story of the Corsair is ultimately a story about adaptation, about how one nation, facing initial defeats and technological inferiority, systematically addressed its weaknesses and transformed them into strengths. It is a story about the relationship between industrial capacity and military effectiveness, about how wars of attrition favor economies that can absorb losses and continue producing. It is a story about the collapse of mythology when confronted with superior material reality, about how confidence built on past victories becomes vulnerability when enemies evolve and improve. For Japanese pilots who faced Corsairs, the experience was transformative and traumatic. They had entered the war believing in their invincibility, in the superiority of their training and their aircraft. They had learned, through bitter experience, that those beliefs were contingent on their enemies' weaknesses rather than their own strengths. When America fielded fighters that could outperform the Zero, not in one aspect but in nearly every aspect that mattered, the mythology dissolved. What remained was the brutal arithmetic of combat. Faster aircraft win, higher climbing aircraft control altitude, heavier armed aircraft inflict more damage. Skill and courage remained important, but they operated within constraints defined by technology and industrial capacity. The Corsair represented those constraints made manifest, a bent-wing reminder that wars are won not only by brave men but by superior tools, not only by warrior spirit but by industrial might, not only by tactical innovation but by strategic resource allocation. It was the physical embodiment of American material abundance applied to the problem of aerial warfare, and it was a problem to which Japanese industry had no answer. In the decades after the war, as historians analyzed the Pacific campaign and veterans recorded their memoirs, the Corsair emerged as one of the iconic aircraft of the conflict, ranking alongside the P-51 Mustang and the Spitfire as symbols of Allied air power. But for those who flew against it, the memory carried different connotations. In Japanese aviation histories, the Corsair appears as a turning point, the aircraft that marked the transition from Japanese offensive operations to defensive last stands, from tactical flexibility to strategic desperation. There is a memorial at Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo where the names of Japanese war dead are recorded. Among them are hundreds of naval aviators killed in the Solomons, at Rabaul, over the Philippines and Okinawa, men who faced Corsairs and Hellcats and died in aircraft that could no longer compete. Their sacrifice is remembered, their courage honored, but the circumstances of their deaths speak to a larger truth about industrial warfare, that individual valor cannot overcome systemic disadvantage, that the best pilots flying obsolescent aircraft will lose to mediocre pilots flying superior machines, that wars of attrition favor nations with greater industrial depth. The Corsair taught that lesson with ruthless efficiency. It climbed faster, flew higher, dove steeper, hit harder than anything Japan could field in comparable numbers. It allowed American pilots to dictate engagement terms, to fight when conditions favored them and disengage when they didn't. It provided the air superiority under which amphibious invasion succeeded, supply convoys sailed unmolested, strategic bombers reached their targets. It was not the only factor in Allied victory, but it was an essential one, the weapon that wrested control of the Pacific skies from Japan and ensured that control was never relinquished. Standing on Henderson Field today, decades removed from the war that once raged across these islands, one can still see the traces of that conflict. The coral runway, now overgrown, the rusted remains of maintenance facilities, the memorial stones marking where men died. The jungle has reclaimed most of what war built here, but the history remains. This was where Corsairs first proved themselves, where the mythology of Japanese air superiority finally broke, where the mathematics of aerial combat shifted irrevocably in America's favor. The wind still carries salt from the ocean. The sun still climbs through tropical haze each morning. But the thunder that once rolled across cloudless skies is gone, replaced by silence and the calls of birds that have forgotten what war sounds like. The Corsairs are gone too, preserved in museums and private collections, their bent wings frozen in permanent display. But what they represented, the power of industrial abundance, the decisiveness of technological superiority, the transformation of material advantage into military victory, remains relevant wherever nations confront the gap between their aspirations and their capabilities. In the end, the Corsair was more than an aircraft. It was an argument, delivered in aluminum and high-octane fuel, that modern warfare is decided as much in factories and design offices as on battlefields, that the nation which builds better tools and deploys them in greater numbers will prevail regardless of its opponent's courage. It was a lesson that Japan learned too late, that its pilots paid for with their lives, that resonates through every conflict where qualitative or quantitative superiority shapes outcomes more decisively than individual valor. The bent-wing birds flew, fought, and conquered. And in their wake, the sky belonged to America.